Further debate. I recognize the member for Ottawa South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to get an opportunity to stand up and speak to this bill, Bill 74. And I want to begin by saying is that I believe that it's the most important thing that we do here. It's really most important when someone's sick. Nothing else matters. I remember when my dad was sick, my mom had a stroke in September, and I had to leave here very quickly, and this place didn't matter. Nothing else in my life mattered. The care for my mom mattered. That was the most important thing. So that's the thing that we do for each other, that we take care of each other at a vulnerable time when we need care, when we need support, when we need health. And it's one of the reasons that I came to Queen Park, as well as obviously representing my community. I think that what's important for us to do here is to improve the quality of our healthcare system, the accessibility of our healthcare system, the affordability of our healthcare system, and make sure that it's there for everybody. Everybody, including those who are vulnerable and marginalized, that there be no language barriers. I think that's a critical thing. I think members in this Assembly share that. I really do believe that. We all have different ways of doing things, and we've seen successive governments go through different models and different decisions about what they believe is important in healthcare and how we should do it. So when I look at this bill, and this is keeping in mind that I think we've been saying the same thing for about 3 decades about what's important in healthcare, that it's patient-centered, that it responds to the needs of the community, that's affordable. We've been saying the same thing for 30 years, and what we're talking about here is a massive structural change. We all want high-quality health care, compassionate care to be there for us, for our family, for our neighbours, for our friends when we need it. But what's proposed in this bill is what I would call a massive centralization. And I've been around long enough to watch a massive centralization and restructuring that occurred in the late 90s and early 2000s. And what happened to communities? The responsiveness of bringing all the decision-making to downtown Toronto. It's had a great big impact on my community in Ottawa. As many people know, there's the Montfort Hospital. The government of the day decided we're closing the hospital. And that was going to have a huge impact, not just on Ottawa, but the Francophone community across Ontario. And what happened was the community had to rise up in great numbers. They filled a hockey arena and a few parking lots. They took the government to court, which I think in this budget it's going to be harder to do that now. And they were successful. And I'll say a bit more about this later when we're talking about the amendments to the bill that were proposed and the kind of jurisprudence there is around Francophone services in Ontario. The same thing happened with the CHEO cardiac unit. The government of the day from downtown Toronto decided we don't need a cardiac unit at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario. We don't need one there. We need it in downtown Toronto. That's it. We're going to cut the program. Again, the community rose up, and Dr. Wilbur Keon, who just passed away about a week ago, prominent heart surgeon and CEO of the Ottawa Heart Institute, did some work that said, actually, no, you can make it work on 2 sites. But it took the community rising up and forcing the government of the day to take a look at that. And so there's a challenge inside this legislation with regards to the responsiveness and of the minister and the power of the minister and the ability for communities to appeal that I'll talk a bit more about later. So this super agency is what I like to call kind of a hyper-corporatization of healthcare in Ontario. So the board, good people, but it looks a lot like a multinational board. And we know how well communities do with multinationals. The centre has the power. The centre's interest is in the centre, not in the branch plants. So I'm very concerned what this bill proposes is going to, again, create a disconnect. It's going to slow down decision-making. Communities' input into that decision-making is not going to be effective. There's no clear kind of community path or community decision-making in this bill at all. It brings it all here to downtown Toronto. And one of the amendments in the bill was we need to take a look at that board and make sure we have representation that, that shows the diversity of Ontario. That we need some Francophone representation. There should be representation from Indigenous peoples. The public nature of our healthcare system demands that we try to represent all of our communities. And as well in this bill, we put forward a number of amendments. Didn't know, Mr. Speaker, whether or not we'd have an opportunity to do with the switch, and I appreciate the government and the members of the legislature allowing us to switch so we could put some amendments forward. One of those amendments was that the board had to hold public meetings. And the government voted that down. I think if we have a publicly funded healthcare system, that board, of which we are all the shareholders, all of us, all the people who live in our communities, we're all shareholders. We need recourse. We need recourse. People have to be able to respond to the needs of communities. The other amendment that was put forward, again, that was defeated, related to the regions of our province, and that board should be meeting in those regions. Somehow, what the government can create sub-regions, so there is some connection with the local leadership and understanding of the local community there enshrined in the legislation. I'd be more comfortable. I think many, many more people would be comfortable. So, I think members on the the member from London, Fanshawe, talked about the consultation in this bill. The reality is this bill is moving at warp speed. Even Mike Harris took more time. This is a fundamental change in the structure of healthcare in Ontario. And the challenge is that, that's not going to fix crowded emergency rooms right now. It's not going to fix it. It's not going to fix it right now. It's not going to fix it next year. It's not going to fix it the year after that. It might start to by the year after that. And, we saw in the budget what measures there were or weren't there to address those things. It's not going to address the issues around primary care or palliative care right now. Those are issues, or a standard of 4 hours of care in long-term care homes. It's not going to address those things. And those are the things that are the pressing needs right now. So I do, like to remind my colleagues that you're making a structural change. It's not going to have an impact for a good period of time, and there are things that need to be addressed right now. So please don't connect those two things together. Right? If you want to connect them together in 4 or 5 years, that's great, but the things that are happening right now need to be addressed right now. So one of the amendments that we put forward as well too was to take a look at the minister's powers. The minister's powers in this bill are almost absolute. It's absolutely incredible. So a minister can issue a directive and only has to give 30 days notice. 30 days, that's incredible. That's not time for somebody to mount a legal challenge, even if they can, when the government's changed it with this budget bill, or for a community to rise up. That's incredible. I propose that we take that to 90 days, and I think my colleagues from the NDP propose 60 days. I think that's reasonable. Both of those got voted down. Both of those amendments got voted down. There was another amendment that said, look, there should be some mechanism for appeal, so I suggested, the Health Services Appeal Review Board. Not a perfect solution, but an indication that says we need to have some mechanism whereby communities can have a voice. The communities can have the right to appeal. Because here's what it is. So who owns Mackenzie Health, right? Who owns the Peterborough Hospice or the Peterborough Regional Health Centre, right? Who owns the hospital or the hospice in your ridings? Is it the minister? No. Is it the super agency? No. Is it the Ministry of Health? No. The people who own it are the people who live in your communities. It's their care, it's their money. And what's happening in this bill is they're not getting a say. And, you can poo-poo what I'm saying right now and say, no, that's not going to happen. But 10 years from now, when they're going to close down something in your community, and you've got 30 days remember, just remember that we had the opportunity. We had the opportunity to give our communities voice. We had the opportunity to protect our communities and the care that's important to them, the care that's theirs. It's their money, it's their care. And we failed to protect them in the bill. 100%. And that's not a criticism, that's a statement of fact. There is not a reasonable time frame for people, for the minister's ability to make an order, and it is unreasonable that there's no appeal mechanism. I'm very disappointed that that's not in the bill, and at the end of the day, that's not serving our communities well. So the board itself doesn't actually have to appear before the Standing Committee on Government Agencies before they take their seat. So we're saying to 12 or 15 people, you're going to take care of the things that are most important to all of us when we need them. You're going to take care of $30 billion worth of spending, because they don't have the whole health care budget from what I understand, but it's still $30 billion. So as members of this Assembly, as representatives of the people, as representatives of the shareholders, we don't get a say. We don't get to ask any questions. There was an amendment put forward in the bill that says every member of that super agency board has to appear before committee. It was voted down. That's wrong. So I will say that there was in the bill a recognition that Francophone and Indigenous rights needed to be there. And the government did put forward, or the government did accept 2 amendments. They're not very big. And another amendment from the NDP as well. And I'm glad that they're there. But we didn't do enough to recognize the importance of French health services in the French language. And that's important because there's about 1,000 pages of jurisprudence that involve the Montfort Hospital. And as part of the government settlement, and you may or may not remember, all of that jurisprudence was entered into record and is now part of jurisprudence in Ontario. So, again, the government may find itself in court. Again, we're not sure how this budget will change people's ability to take the government to court, and that's going to cost money. I think it would have been simpler to ensure that the role of Francophones, the Francophone services in this bill was made stronger. The bill does not mention the Canada Health Act. It doesn't reference it at all. I know that that was brought forward by my colleagues over here in the NDP. I think that's an important amendment, an important inclusion in that bill that we should have made. So I just, I want to back up again here and speak to what's really happening here. This is a massive centralization, okay, that's going to remove communities' role in deciding the care that they receive. It's taking it right away. And that's not right. It's like, it's incredible that we're moving in that direction. And there's, if the government had created some balance inside that bill that says, well, we do have this board and we're centralizing this, but communities have this kind of role, it would give us some more comfort. If we protected communities or gave them recourse from a minister's order. No, I'm not going to say that anyone in this assembly, okay, is going to use a minister's order in a negative way. I'm not suggesting that the minister would do that. But we're not just writing the legislation for this parliament. We're writing it for future parliaments. And as I said earlier, the changes that are outlined here, they're going to take years. It's a big ship. So I'm worried about what's going to happen 10 or 15 years from now, when there's another government that could be any one of us here. What recourse do our communities have when a decision is made that adversely affects the care that they receive, or that in the case of a rural hospital or health service, that's not only going to affect the care that they receive, but, and as many of you know who represent rural communities, an employment centre, something that anchors the community. And I think the government should have done more to get the balance right. I think a balance between community and an agency would have been the right thing to do. I do believe that that if you take a look at the experience in Alberta in terms of hyper-centralization, they're going back to regional care. I think the government would have been better to take a look at regional care and make the number of regions smaller, look at the powers that the regions have so that they can be more effective. Whereas, you know, LHINs were not all the same, and they were in part evolving, some of them evolving quicker than others. And I can understand the challenge and the frustration that people express. I mean, I come from a LHIN where we didn't have those challenges. It was very responsive to the community's needs. It found ways of bringing people together to collaborate and get the outcomes, and not necessarily all in the same way as they would do in another community. You know, community-based care, community decision-making, community role, the development and use of leadership that exists in a community to actually do things together that, that will ensure that we get the outcomes that we want is important. And I'm concerned that with this bill and this centralization that you're going to lose some of those things. The care groups, I can understand where the government's coming from on that. The risk in there, though, again, is the same as with the centralization, is that the people who have all the power right now, the people who have all the money, the hospitals, the corporations, are going to have an advantage. They're going to have an advantage in those things, and we're going to be relying on their goodwill to do the right thing. And I think there's a risk in that. You know, I think the smaller community partners are valuable, and there's a way of bringing people together to work together to get the outcomes that we want. And we have to respect those things in communities. I think that's where the bill, you know, the bill falls down. And we didn't do enough to protect our communities. You know, I'm going to say it again, but in 10 or 15 years, we don't know who's going to be sitting in that chair. None of us know. We don't know what party they're going to belong to, who that person is, what the pressures are. And there is an imbalance of the power of the minister as it relates to our communities. Doesn't matter whether it's my community or the community in Glengarry, Prescott, Russell, or Sarnia. We're all going to have to answer those questions when someone goes to make that move. And again, I'm not suggesting that this minister is going to be the one to make that move, but what I'm saying is there's a risk. There's a risk that people will make decisions that don't work for our communities, that don't work for the care that's theirs, that don't work for the money that they've invested, not only through their tax dollars, but through their charitable donations. So many of us have hospitals and hospices, and we know how hard it is to get that 10%. At least right now, we have time and a recourse. Okay? It's not perfect. Ministers still have powers. But at least we still have that. And I would encourage or implore the government to look at that. Because it's not about next year or the year after that or the year after that. It's where are we going to be in 5, 10, 15 years if we don't actually put a balance on that power. And I want to thank you, Speaker, for allowing me this time, and I'll sit down and wait for response.